Greetings. Welcome to another Sabbath Insight. Shalom. Today I want to speak about the idea of calling, and when I say call on me, as you see in the title, I'm not speaking about prayer or even prayer as performance. Typically in ANU, we do use the terminology of affirmation. We don't necessarily pray in the same way that you might, because we're affirming the vision that's already been given, and the power and the capacity of the Almighty. But I want to specifically tune into the concept of invocation and the spiritual technology behind what actually answers you in life. One of the things that I spoke about in the last segment, or I touched upon briefly, was sometimes people having that feeling of like, I'm reaching out and I'm speaking to the creator or God, and it feels like I'm getting nothing back, or I don't know if it's me or the creator speaking. And sometimes people think that invocation is a verbal thing. They imagine that they yell at a certain amplitude or a certain intensity, and depending on how loud they cry out or how long they pray or how many scriptures that they recite, or they can quote, that will increase the value of the invocation. But invocation is a lot deeper because it's an inscription, it's an impression. Invocation is a mark, very similar to your character. And it's a mark that when you're invoking, it's the mark that your life carves out into the unseen world, which is larger than the seen world. There's more unseen around us than there is seen. And in magic, we call those impressions sigils, and sigils are symbols that are created from desire. They're created from intention and from will, and usually they're charged with energy, and they're released into the unseen world, right? So they can attract whatever it is that they may represent. But there's something I want you to understand about that. You don't have to study magic to create sigils. Your lifestyle is already creating it forward. Your emotional patterns, your clutter, your discipline, your rebellion, your truthfulness, your environment, all of that becomes a symbolic imprint that broadcasts a frequency that calls forth the spiritual world for exactly what kind of presence you're prepared to host, right? So a sigil is a form of a condensed intention, turned into form. So, but intention, I want you to understand, doesn't necessarily begin on paper. Sometimes we do exercises like that. You write something down or put it in writing, but your intention doesn't begin with what you write down. Your intention begins with your life pattern. That's how you start your intentions. So your life is always writing. You're always Tahuti. You're always Seshat. You're always scribing the Sesh, and your home is always writing something. Your decisions, your reactions, your tone, these are all writings. You're writing into a sacred grimoire. So all of it becomes a spiritual shorthand or a living symbol. And that's why you can pray to the Elohim while unintentionally broadcasting sigils, that attract chaos, right? Some households never know peace. And that's because the environment itself is an emblem of confusion. And it's something very important I want you to understand there. A confused and cluttered home psychologically triggers to your nervous system that there's an emergency happening. Even though you may not mean, you may be peaceful or think you're at peace in your slop. But when you have clutter and junk all over the place, whether you like it or not, subconsciously it triggers to your mind that there's an emergency happening, and your cortisol levels then rise, at that point to meet whatever is happening. But you have to understand how your environment can become an emblem or a broadcast of confusion, and some relationships become portals as well. The behavioral symbols that between two people can summon what they might have more than what they may have intended. It could summon and call on Elohim, not necessarily because they're speaking louder or anything like that. But you can create a life whose symbols welcome the creator. In the Quran, it says, I am near. I respond to the call of the caller when he calls upon me. So if you think about that more from like a metaphysical perspective, um, response requires resonance. Not necessarily like in the mystical sense, but in the sense that your internal and external state have to be suitable for divine presence. Okay. So even when you look in Exodus 19th chapter, it says, if you obey my voice, you will be my treasured possession. So obedience shapes the inner world, and obedience recognizes the soul, and obedience reconfigures your symbolic life so it becomes compatible with holiness. So just like, prayer is speech, but invocation is signature. Okay. And your signature is the actual sigil your life then broadcasts every single day. So you might say, like, well, why doesn't God answer me? And the real question is, what symbol or symbols has my life been sending out? What inscriptions have I written with my habits? What sigils have I carved with my emotions? What does the atmosphere of my home silently announce to the world? Because the Most High responds to the ones whose life reflects the Creator's order. But the forces of confusion, if you're dealing with the Creator of all the worlds, that's not that there's a divine intelligence and design there. That's not confusion, right? So if you're broadcasting chaos, you're going to call something else. So the forces of confusion and chaos respond to the ones whose life reflects theirs. So your life is always calling something. You just have to ask yourself, what does your signature summon, right? Um, when the creator speaks about obedience, it's not talking about submission just to submit. It's speaking about order, structure, about the condition of the vessel, because obedience isn't just rule following. Obedience is configuration. Obedience shapes a person into something that can actually hold the presence of the creator. Without that shape, there's no capacity for even response. This is why you'll read in certain places about obedience and nearness and excellence. It says, if you obey if you obey my voice and keep my commandments, you'll be my treasured possessions, like I said. So what that's saying is that obedience creates possession, meaning the vessel now becomes fit for divine claim through obedience. Being treasured requires structure. I want to really share this with my sisters listening. Nothing that is chaotic is ever treasured. Sometimes I get situations with, and it's always with the women for some reason, where they want me to work with them or do consultations. And they'll start by saying, Chief, I just want you to know I'm a handful and I'm a lot and I'm a headache, but I need your help. No, no, no one loves chaos, especially if I come from a spiritual architecture of order. Then you're not going to be treasured if you're chaotic. The universe doesn't treasure you if you're chaotic. Your plants and flowers don't grow during storms. During storms, you're worried about them. So when you look at Deuteronomy, it says the blessings will come upon you, Deuteronomy 28. The blessings will come upon you and overtake you if you obey the voice of Elohim. So blessings don't respond to noise, they respond to order. You wonder around like your life is looking crazy and whatnot. Does your life look crazy? Does your inner world look crazy? The Quran even speaks about obey Allah and the messenger so that you may receive mercy, right? Again, you see obey there. So mercy is not something that just happens randomly. Mercy responds to the vessel that honors divine order. So obedience is a form shaping sort of force, right? And when you obey divine instruction, not just necessarily just doing what you're told, you're reshaping your inner architecture. So the presence of the originator, of the creator, of the most high, of the most inner can now dwell without any distortions. That distortion piece is very key. It's very important. Um, You think of obedience as a sigil that's carved into your spirit. So every act of truthfulness sharpens the symbol. Every act of restraint strengthens the lines of that symbol. Every act of responsibility, what it begins to do is deepen the imprint. So your life now becomes marked with a recognizable spiritual signature. Doesn't have a whole bunch of distortions. It's very clear. Oh, this is what it is because of your consistency of obedience to order and structure. So the creator even has an imprint, and the creator responds to its own imprint. And it's not because the creator needs validation, but because order calls to order, just like holiness calls to holiness. Psychologically, obedience recognizes the mind. It eliminates internal contradictions, the cognitive dissonance. It reduces clarity, increases chaos. It creates consistency, and consistency is something that the nervous system then interprets um, as safety. That's important for any of you who are working in environments where you're dealing with people who are trauma impacted, or systems impacted. You know, um, Consistency and predictability is important for them to understand the value of safety. That's just a side note for anyone who's working in that field or around individuals like that. That's just a part of trauma informed psychology. When the inner world stabilizes, the outer world becomes receptive to divine influence. You see, so disobedience breaks the shape. It distorts the symbol. It weakens the internal structure, and it produces this sort of chaotic signature that doesn't attract any divine presence. It attracts the forces that thrive in disorder. Okay? So when the Elohim says, call on me, the Elohim is not saying, call on me with loud words or, tears or whatever performance or display that you often see people put on. The creator is saying, shape yourself into the kind of vessel that I can actually answer. That's not punitive. That's just spiritual physics. Divine presence rests where divine order is respected. So blessings overtake the one who's carved with the right sigil in divine discipline, truthful and way of life. Obedience is not necessarily, like again, it's a carving tool. The presence of Elohim is the one who recognizes Elohim's own mark. So if obedience shapes the vessel, then your discipline will strengthen it, right? Discipline is not a punishment. Discipline is being able to govern yourself. Discipline and being able to be a person who cannot govern themselves is unfit to host anything divine. If you lack discipline or self-discipline, you'll never have divine indwelling or presence, right? So most people who want the Most High to move in their lives, a lot of time, I don't say most, but many, they don't possess the internal stability to hold what they're asking for. So discipline is the foundation of spiritual capacity. If you look at Proverbs 25:28, a person without self-control is like a city broken down without walls, right? So that's a key piece right there. A city broken down without walls. It's a city without walls is a city that's undefended. It's unsheltered. It's open to invasion. So the lack of discipline becomes an open gate, right? If you read the Quran, 91st chapter, it says a person who purifies, who succeeds, who purifies his soul, and he fails, the one who fails is the one who corrupts it, right? Paraphrasing. So purification doesn't become just like a spiritual bath or a ritual washing. So many people ask for that. Purification is the stripping away of anything that's excess. It's the removal of impulses that weaken your spiritual signature. See, it all comes back to the signature. So discipline is purification, but in motion. It's discipline is active purification. The 76th chapter of the Quran says we test him by giving him hearing and sight, right? We test him by giving him hearing and sight. That could be translated as you're tested by what captures you. You see, discipline decides whether you fall into desire or you fall into mastery. No, I'm going to say it like this, a better way. Whether you fall into desire or you rise into mastery. Okay. Discipline is a force that sharpens a person's sort of like spiritual signature. Your signature or your sigil becomes so key because like where obedience shapes the sigil, discipline etches it. It's like if you're carving it over and over. Let's say if you were disciplined enough to carve something into a rock every day, you know, um, the intention. I always have this visualization. I'm gonna share it. I used to imagine when I was a young person that if I was ever locked away into a space, if I could use consistent force to free myself from that space. And I'm gonna explain what I mean. I remember years ago there was a movie that came out, The Birdman of Alcatraz with Clint Eastwood, right? And I used to always watch these movies about people escaping. I was like obsessed with people escaping their situation, whether it was slavery or whatever. And I would think like, okay, if I took my finger and I just scraped every day on a concrete wall, would I eventually wear my finger down or wear the wall down? Or I would think if were behind metal bars and every day I pulled against those bars, would over time, let's see, even if it takes 5, 10 years, would there be any shift in those bars? They eventually weaken. That's discipline. It etches your sigil deeply by pressing intention into reality through repetition. You see. If you lack discipline, you'll lack consistency, you'll lack repetition, you'll lack the ability to break through, to break free. Every time you restrain your tongue, for instance, your sigil deepens. When you have a disciplined and modest tongue, I speak about that in the ANU way. Modesty isn't just not wearing clothes that are sexual provocative. Modesty begins in your heart, your ability to restrain yourself. Every time you refuse emotional chaos, you're strengthening your sigil, you're practicing modesty. When you wake with a purpose and consistency, then the sigil the character, the brand, it starts to become more clear. That's why disciplined people walk with a lot of authority. And the reason being is because their inner world isn't scattered. Their spiritual signature is consistent, and consistency makes the vessel recognizable, right? So discipline generates density inside of your spirit, makes your spirit, but good density. A disciplined soul has weight to it. So that's a soul or a spirit of substance. It holds a charge. It anchors divine presence. Psychologically, discipline restores the nervous system. It creates rhythm. It emulates. It eliminates uh, confusion. The mind no longer will treat life like it's a threat. You see, because the self is under stable management now. I know someone needed to hear that. You wake up every day and you look at life like, oh, what's going to happen now? You hear terms like life is a bitch and things like that. Like life is just this big threat. A stable mind becomes a throne, and the throne attracts rulership. That's why Elohim responds to discipline. You see, not because Elohim is impressed by it, or impressed by your suffering. Some people, or there are some systems where people will go through long spells of suffering to show their devotion. That's not how the universe works. Order only rests on structure, and discipline is structure. So that's why you can fast for 30 days and still not feel close to God, right? Because fasting without discipline is just a diet. And sometimes you might even attach some scriptures to that diet, but you can pray loud and still attract very wrong energies into your life. Because what happens is when your emotional world is undisciplined, an undisciplined soul will then broadcast instability into the unseen realm. So now your life becomes a beacon. It's a beacon, it's a flare that goes off into the sky. Your life becomes that beacon or that flare or that lighthouse for whatever thrives in instability. When you have discipline governing your steps, right? Your habits, your tongue, your appetite, your emotions, you're not just improving your life, you're forging a spiritual identity that the divine presence then recognizes, because discipline makes you a vessel. A vessel makes you dependable. And the dependable ones, or the chosen ones who are dependable, those are the ones that the heavenly systems invest their time and energy into. You see, stillness is not inactivity. I spoke about that in a recent segment. Stillness is permission. When you read scriptures like, be still and know that I am Elohim. You see that stillness is actually, it's the inner state that actually invites the Elohim to occupy space. It's that time when you recognize that noise has been dominating my space, and I'm going to clear the noise out to allow space. Most people don't really hear Elohim or God. We'll use God, because they never stop vibrating on frequencies that choke out clarity. You see, they pray too loud, and then they think chaotically. They quote a whole bunch of scriptures, but then they run from silence. They ask for guidance, but then they never create an environment where guidance can even land. Because stillness is not the absence of movement. Stillness is the presence of order. And order is where divine presence reveals itself. As a consultant and a counselor and a coach, for years I've been dealing with this. People call me for guidance. They pay. You get on the phone or you get in front of them. You might be face to face. They don't want to listen to a word you have to say. Or it's always the ones who the first thing they do when they get in front of you say, okay, let me tell you something about me. Don't need it. They want to run down. They want to create and frame the narrative first. And then when you say anything that's different than that narrative, to say, okay, maybe you didn't hear me clearly. Maybe I didn't explain myself. Okay, you just want someone, you want to pay money for someone to agree with your narrative. You see, I'm not a flying monkey. There are some people who keep flying monkeys around them. You know, ain't feces people tend to keep ain't feces people around them to always strengthen their narrative. That's another sign of or a technique of the narcissist. Narcissists will always run to another ain't feces person to get confirmation, to convince themselves of a narrative when they want to do something evil to another person. They'll start to triangulate to get a different framing. You see, first thing they do, and they'll find an ain't feces person, because a good person will say, nah, something don't, or I'm only hearing one side of this. What about the other side, right? A narcissistic person will run from a person like that, get rid of them, because no, you ain't confirming what I want to hear. You see, a person like that will never receive divine presence, ever. That level of emotional disorder will only attract things that revel in disorder. You see, when you look at Psalms 46, it says again, "Be still." 46:10, "Be still, know that I'm Elohim." If you look at the sequence in that, stillness leads to knowing. Be still and know. Knowing is the revelation, but without the first, the stillness, go back to the segment I did on running away. Without the stillness first, you can't access the second, the knowing. So if you can't sit still and remove the noise, see, some people invite the noise. They invite opinions and thoughts and ideas that make no sense. You see, but it confirms what they want to do. It creates more internal noise. So Elohim never gets there. They never have to feel accountable for anything because God never showed up. So when you look at Exodus 33, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. Presence and rest are inseparable. So when you have a breathing that's frantic, your mind is scattered and your emotions are unsettled, then the divine presence may make an appearance, but it won't linger long in an environment like that. You know, the Quran says, remember your Lord within yourself, without loudness and without words. Sounds like stillness, right? Divine remembrance is not primarily vocal, you know, it's posturing yourself internally. It's the way you sit and situate yourself internally. Quiet remembrance then is the seal that invites presence. You know, the Quran, it talks about this 73rd chapter. It talks about the solitude that happens at night and at a time when the external world kind of goes silent, so the inner world can now open up. Some people, like myself, we look forward to sunset when everything gets dark, or to a quiet room, you know, where we could just have a candle lit, or a some soft music playing even, or some incense burning, everybody sleep and not asking for anything. If you're a man, men, a lot of times we get a lot of requests throughout the day, a lot of phone calls, a lot of texts. We wake up to that, especially when you're surrounded by people who are not tuned into you spiritually, but they have tuned into into you functionally. You can provide this function, but spiritually, maybe the man needs rest. He needs to be away. Some people are not tuned in like that. So we look forward to the night when everybody goes to bed, right? And you could just sit in that dark room and your inner world can open up. Metaphysically speaking, stillness is a reset of the spiritual field. So your spirit itself is an instrument. And when that instrument is overwhelmed with noise, and noise, what is noise, right? I'm not just talking about like, maybe you live in a busy area or high traffic area. Noise is fear. Noise is worry. Noise is chatter. Noise is emotional overflow. So when that happens, your spirit, the instrument, it starts to vibrate chaotically from all the fear, from all the worry, that's the noise. And what happens, again, looking at it from a metaphysical perspective, that chaotic vibration is an actual sigil, but it's a scattered sigil. It's a scattered sigil. It's faint. It's broken. Um, it's a confused signature, and it never reaches upward, but it also doesn't stabilize inward. So what happens is when you become still, like truly still, your internal instrument, it settles down and the soul re-enters that space of coherence. So your spiritual signature becomes readable again. It's almost like a crying child. You know how like you want to help, but until they maybe they're wailing, and until they stop, you don't know. Like you say, what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? And and they just going off, and you like, I want to help, but I can't help because I can't hear you, right? So when there comes a place of stillness, now everything sharpens. So stillness does a couple of things, metaphysically speaking. It clears the residue of emotional noise, right? Noise, emotional noise, it creates different distortions. And distortions are clarity repellents. Uh, Dark, or let me say, shadow forces, or what we call demons or damians, they feed on noise, but in stillness, they lose their grip. So stillness strengthens also the other thing it does, the sigil of your inner world. A quiet soul etches a sort of very clean spiritual symbol. And that symbol becomes the flare, again, the beacon for divine response. Also, the silence reorders psychic energy. Psychologically, stillness, it does something that medication tries to mimic, but it can't. Stillness lowers emotional turbulence. It reduces mental fragmentation. Stillness slows the mind so the body can exhale properly, and it reduces mental fatigue. It restores internal boundaries as well. So a person who can't be still can't receive any divine revelation, because revelation requires space, and space can only be created through quiet, right? That's why some people never have any guidance. They mistake noise for progress. They think constant motion means spiritual activity. And they also think that busyness equates to impact. Spiritually speaking, busyness is often a mask for fear. Noise is usually just a distraction from responsibility, you see. So constant movement is something that people will do to avoid hearing the truth. But stillness, what it does is it's like paint stripper. It strips away excuses. You know, it exposes the things that you've been avoiding. It reveals the voice that you've been drowning out through all the noise, intentional noise. And that's why the Most High calls us into silence. It's not to empty you, or to um, just make you like, voiceless. The silence that you're called into is to prepare you, because in stillness now, the spirit and the soul become sanctuaries. The inner worlds now become livable. When you got all that noise, all that fear, all that impulsivity, you can't even live with yourself. See, in stillness, the presence of the Elohim is able to find a place to rest, to find a Sabbath, because silence is the throne of the all in all. You could go into nature. I've heard people say that they can't sleep in nature because of the sound of all the bugs and stuff. And I'm not trying to speak about against anyone, but if you have that issue, it's time that you do some serious work. When nature becomes an irritant to you, nature is silent, but you're like, oh, but what about all the sound of things rustling in the leaves and the different bugs and insects and the birds and but that's not noise. Those are sounds. There is a nuanced difference. I want to speak about how nature services us in a way. Service, sometimes we get confused on that. Service isn't charity, and service isn't weakness. Service isn't just doing somebody a favor. I have seen people, even in my own movement, ANU Nation. I'm Chief Yuya, by the way. Come in and think that the service that they provide will then erase the lack of character or the dysfunction that they also bring, and maybe even attempt to breed. Service, real service is participation in the creative work of the creator. That's what real service is. It's when you serve others, but with righteousness, not just because it's something to do or because it's fun or you like doing it. You're serving with righteousness. You broadcast a spiritual signature that says this vessel is available for divine use. And in that moment, the creator responds to vessels that are usable. So there are people who will affirm or pray for power, but power is only given to those who think of others. Power is never given to those who only think of themselves. So power rests on those who have extended themselves outward righteously. Why? Because that's the same way that the Elohim extends himself into creation. So service isn't just about helping people. Service is about mirroring the divine nature. Oh, you extend yourself, I extend myself. And when you are becoming that image of the divine nature, that is the highest form of invocation that you could ever do. It's the highest form. Not the Solomon magic, not working with the 72 Goetia or the vertebrae in your spine, which relate to those 72 Goetia, not the limbic magic. It's imaging yourself in the same way that the divine nature does. There's a scripture in Isaiah that says, if you pour yourself out for the hungry, then Yahuwah will guide you continually. So outpouring equals guidance, or outpouring will then lead to guidance. Like we could, again, if you break that scripture down using metacognition or metaphysics, outpouring leads to guidance. And it's not because Elohim rewards you, but because service transforms the vessel into something that is now divinely navigable. We have a covering initiative inside of ANU where every woman who comes in is not exposed to the elements, if you will, spiritual elements, the emotional elements, the social elements, but she has a man who is responsible to her and accountable for her. But I've said it in the past, and I hope we get to a point where I don't have to say it. Some women are not coverable. They just got too much of the Jezebel in them. They're too hard-headed. They're too hell-bent on controlling men and everyone around them because of their own insecurities. You see, you can't cover them. They won't stay under the umbrella, right? So that scripture speaks about how one becomes coverable. Your vessel has to be prepared to receive the divine. Proverbs 11:25 says, he who refreshes others will be refreshed. We could say she who refreshes others will be refreshed. Don't just take it as just women don't have to deal with this. Refreshment is not a compensation. Refreshment is the spiritual consequence of one who lives as a divine channel. We know that because the Quran says righteousness is giving wealth to relatives. It's giving to the orphans, giving to the needy, and giving to the traveler, right? So service is an expression of righteousness. It's not something that adds on to your righteousness, right? It says in the scriptures, help one another in righteousness and piety. So help is righteousness. Service should be piety. Outreach is worship. So when you serve, you don't lower yourself, but you're ascending towards a divine pattern. You see, service is one of the strongest forms of invocation because it does a couple of things. Service makes sure it dissolves spiritual stagnation. Service, let's just say a stagnated soul becomes a closed container, and closed containers can't receive breath from above, right? So when you serve, you create a moment in your inner world, and that moment breaks the calcification. It breaks the ego. It breaks self-obsession. It's the moment that you become a living sigil, a symbol of circulation, of generosity, of usefulness. So as the divine presence responds to the circulation of the gifts, you start to receive more gifts, right? So service elevates your spiritual signature. Just the act of giving without manipulation etches a symbol on the soul. To give without manipulation That one goes out to all of my fellow spiritual and community chiefs and leaders. Y'all know what we attract. We attract manipulators, narcissists, people who are self-obsessed. That's what we attract because we're overflowing with love and service. So people always think that a relationship with us is a relationship based around service. So when we don't service them, they think the relationship is dead. And when they service us, it comes with an attachment. Chief, I want to give you this. Chief, I want to do this for you. It's only to open a door for more usury. So oftentimes, and y'all know, we have to say no to a lot of things that we would have otherwise said yes to, but because we know what's attached to it. It's service with manipulation. So when you're servicing without manipulation, now you create a sigil of generosity, of justice, of even-handedness, compassion. And that symbol becomes readable in the unseen world. You see, forces and entities of corruption avoid those sort of sigils, those sort of signatures. It's almost like in the movie, when they hold the cross up and the vampire, right? Which ain't really real. Vampires, that don't mean nothing. They sitting right up inside of those churches, but nonetheless, but you get the image and the idea. I remember I had a client years ago who was going through something, and she was like, "Yeah, I put a cross on my door because I'm having a problem with this and that and that." And I said, "That ain't doing nothing." And she was like, "What?" I said, "That cross ain't doing nothing but inviting the wrong things into your home." I said, "You better off putting a veve of legba on your door. You get a little further with that." Yeah, I told you we're ANU. We're not Christians. All right. So the symbol that you create through your true generosity and service, it becomes readable in the unseen world. And forces of corruption, like I said, they avoid those kind of symbols because they can't inhabit vessels that mirror divine traits. The all in all draws closer because likeness recognizes likeness. You see? It's just like sometimes in life, we want to be around people who seem like us, look like us, talk like us, act like us. I was in a situation recently where I had to purchase something, and I was in I was kind of in a foreign environment with people who were not my people, and they did something. It was a service, and I knew that they didn't do the service properly. And I had to restrain myself from what would have been a natural reaction because I knew it would have been escalated beyond what my expression really was. And in that moment, I remember saying to myself, man, I wish I was dealing with my people right now. Because if something wasn't done correctly, I could have reacted the way I would have been natural, not angrily or hostile or anything. But I know being in that other environment, they would have interpreted it as hostile. They basically ripped me off, and I knew they ripped me off. And then they realized I knew that they ripped me off. And in that environment, there was only but so much I could say and do, But if it was my people, I could have said, like, yo, come on, that's not right because of this, that. And it would have been interpreted and understood, the unspoken, so forth and so on, right? Like draws nearer and recognize like. There's some things in this society I don't get. When skinny jeans came out around early 2000s, 03, 02, 03, I didn't get it, right? I didn't recognize it. That was at a time where I was really almost at the height of fighting. A lot of sparring, a lot of, teaching at that time, martial arts and stuff. So to put on some tight jeans, I can't kick with those. And I remember saying that, like, you can't kick with those. You can't run with those. Like, you can't do anything based around warrior arts with pants on like that. Now, I'm not saying you have to wear the big baggy genes of, the early 90s or anything like that, because those came with their own problems too. But I need to be able to kick chest height. I need to be able to get down low if I want to try to take someone to the ground or something. I can't do that in those. So I didn't identify with anyone who wore something like that. You see, that wasn't recognizable to me. I understood the warfare tactic behind putting these type of clothes on young men, where now you can't hide a weapon. There's nowhere to put it. You can't hide it. And you can't run if you're being chased, and you can't fight. Okay, I get that. I see what you're doing, but I don't recognize it as likeness to myself. Right. And I'm sure you all have different examples of that, and what that may mean. And sometimes how that's corrupted, you know. Um, Another thing about service restructures the psychology. Service reduces ego-based anxiety because what happens is it interrupts extra rumination. It lifts the nervous system out of survival mode, when you lock yourself into service. And the reason being because the mind is not built to fixate on itself. The creator didn't design your mind that way, that your every thought is about you all the time. You notice when you're always thinking about yourself, you're full of a lot of fear and anxiety all the time. So because what happens is when you're fixating on you all the time, your mind collapses inwards, where service expands your psyche outward. You see, and when it expands it outwards, it reestablishes the person as part of a larger purpose. So a soul that lives in purpose is a soul that radiates a signal that's strong enough for divine guidance to land on or settle on. It's a much deeper lesson in there when we talk about the descending of the glory of the Most High and building the temple to exact specifications so that the Most High can descend in a cloud of glory and then dwell therein. The temple. Okay. So that's why there's a lot of people who will feel stagnant spiritually because everything in their life revolves around themselves. They want direction without usefulness, or they want to have a blessing without any responsibility. People who want to have all these revelations in life without any sacrifice. But revelation comes to those who create channels. You got to create a channel in your psyche, not a dam. A lot of people they create dams. You see, so when you serve, you become like a flowing river. And rivers are where spirits move. Service itself is an invocation. Service itself is a form of magnetism. Service itself is spiritual architecture because the heavens and nature are always serving us. A servant's heart becomes a throne. And again, Elohim sees a throne, sits on it. Elohim can't sit on your excuses. So truth is another piece. Sometimes people say, this is my truth. That's just an excuse for you not to submit yourself to the truth. Truth isn't your opinion. Truth isn't even your information. Truth isn't my truth. Truth is a force. And it's one of the highest forces a human can ever wield, is truth. You see, truth is a signature of Elohim himself, or the Elohim themselves. Like we all have a signature. We all have a sigil. Truth is the sigil of God. I'm going to use that term. So when you speak the truth and when you live the truth and when you uphold the truth, you're summoning the presence of the one whose essence is actually truth. So truth is not just a moral stance. Truth is a metaphysical stance. Truth straightens out your inner world. It stabilizes your soul. Truth reveals and it purifies and it corrects. So wherever truth operates, El Elyon, Adonai, draws closer. Wherever truth is denied, the presence of the Creator leaves. If you look at Psalms 51:6, it says, "You desire truth in the inward parts." So that could be translated as truth must exist at your core, not just in your mouth. Truth has to be the condition of your spirit, as opposed to a performance that you do with your lips. You know, you read Proverbs, it says lying lips are in Proverbs 12. I think it's 12:22. It's either 12:22 or 22:12. But lying lips are an abomination, but those who act faithfully are his delight, right? So again, it's not talking about morality, it's talking about spiritual compatibility. Lies distort your vessel. And then the lies begin to bend the internal structure away from the divine presence. Whereas truth makes the vessel straight. Truth straightens out the vessel. And it makes the vessel fit for habitation. The Quran says, fear Allah and speak words of straight truth. Straight truth. Why is it straight truth? Why didn't the Quran say, fear Allah and speak words of truth? Because straight truth are truths that are not convenient. Clear truth is truth that's not manipulated speech. See, there are truths that are upright. So just like when the Quran said, the one who brings the truth and believes in it, they are the righteous. Righteousness is something that shows you that truth is embodied. Righteousness, technically, if we were to define it, is doing the right thing at the right time, but righteousness is the embodiment of truth. So truth is not just something that you claim. Truth is something that you become. So truth, from a metaphysical perspective, functions as a purifying fire in the unseen world, where lies create a distortion. Truth creates clarity, and truth creates straightness, and truth creates coherence. So truth strengthens the spiritual signature. Every truthful act that you do sharpens your sigil and imprints your soul broadcast. So truth now, it starts to carve a more clean line inside of the inner world. You remember when Yahweh Shai said, in my father's house there are many mansions. If it were not so, I wouldn't have told you, and I go to prepare a place for you. So there's a concept there that there's a seen world and an unseen world, or an outer world and an inner world. It also talks about the things that we bind in heaven being bound on earth. Thy will be done as on earth as it is in heaven. So there's a parallel correspondence happening at the same time. So you can create your avatar, sharpen, empower your avatar that exists in another dimension, the dimension of causes, the ones, because we live in a dimension of effect. And these are the ways that you're doing it, the things that I'm describing, Clean lines are what are a symbol that the Elohim recognizes. You ever had your child draw you a picture and you couldn't figure out what it was? You're like, oh, what is this, sweetheart? And you can't really do much with what it is because you don't know what the heck it is. But when you're using truth, or a child is creating a truthful replication of what's being viewed at, In 3D reality, you see exactly what it is. Truth becomes a spiritual address because also another important thing, truth repels forces, corrupt forces. Dark shadow energies feed on distortions. They thrive where there's deception. They thrive where there's secrecy. They thrive where there's confusion. They thrive where there's double mindedness. See, truth generates a frequency that disrupts dark or shadow energies' ability to anchor. Truth starves out everything that relies on deception. You know, one of the things that truth does is that it stabilizes your psyche. You know, a mind that's accustomed to lies, it has to constantly rearrange itself to maintain the deception. You ever have somebody lie on you? You got some people that's all they do. They use people, and then the grass for them is always green on the other side. So they live their life triangulating all the time. They'll be around you and then constantly looking over, because they don't appreciate anything, so they take for granted what you give them. So they're constantly always looking over the fence at the neighbor's grass, looking at what they could get over there, right? Grass is green on the other side. So in order to justify what they're going to do to leap over that fence, they have to spin a narrative about you, right? What happens is that they do this. This is their life. They just go from yard to yard to yard to yard to yard, spinning a narrative. I'm going to stay with you. 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 Now, if they go to 20 different houses, that's 20 different people that they had to become. That's 20 different lies that they had to tell. So what happens over time is that they start to forget their lies. Stuff ceases to add up. But the person who's truthful is going to be consistent. It's going to consistently say the same thing. They were over here. They kept looking over the fence. Then one day they said I was a whatever. They made me into some kind of villain. And they told everybody I was the villain, made up some story, and then hopped the fence. Then the next person is going to say, well, they did the same thing to me. The next person, they did the same thing to me. Right, 20 times. You see, that's a mind, usually it's a narcissistic mind, that's accustomed to lies. So it's constantly rearranging itself. So it has to become this thing over here, and this thing over here, and this thing over here, and this thing over here. So what that does is not only does it produce a lot of emotional exhaustion, but it produces a high level of mental fragmentation. You see, it produces a high level of spiritual confusion. If you've been in a situation like that, or you are that person, we'll come back and we'll see you when you're around 65, 70 years old. That's when stuff really starts to leak bad. You start to see a lot of mental issues, from years of mental fragmentation. You see. See, what happens is that truth simplifies, keeps things simple. And, I was sharing that with one of my consorts recently. I don't know what we're talking about. I was sharing with her how easy I am to maintain. I'm very easy because, we were talking about food or something. I said, I eat the same things all the time. And I don't need a whole bunch of frilly embellishment to make a meal enjoyable for me. In fact, I don't like it. I will eat mono meals at times, but even when I'm not doing mono meals, I'm eating very simply and I'm eating pretty much the same thing all the time. Right. Because I don't eat necessarily for feeling, Man, I feel like some of this, I feel like I eat for what I need. So that makes it simple, right? If I'm feeling low on protein, I need some extra protein. I need, I pretty much never need extra fat, but, I need some extra protein, or I need more hydration, it's simple, real simple, you know, because the body will tell you truthfully, this is what I'm missing, or this is what I'm needing, or so forth and so on. It's very simple. If you read the side of a package of candy or something, there's all these different chemicals and stuff. The body never asks you for any of those type of things. It never asks you for that. The body asks you for the same things all the time. Um, I need protein. Uh, I need energy. I need some starch. I need some energy. I need some protein, or I need some water. Or I need some something that's going to break things down more. So I need some vegetables. That's it. Simple, right? The stuff that you put on it and in it is the stuff that actually makes you sick, you know? So truth creates a clarity, and truth brings the entire inner world into singularity. It becomes like a united state, your whole world, where revelation can then be received. So truth increases spiritual authority. A truthful person walks with weight. Their words and carry a consequence. Their presence carries a strong impact. I'm speaking from experience, not trying to toot my own horn or anything, but I'm speaking from what people come back and say to me, you know. And the reason is because truth exists, or truth is the foundation upon which power sits. So when the creator invests authority into a vessel, it will only invest authority into a vessel that carries its own nature. So truth births authority, but lies birth instability. That's why, again, you can pray if that's what you do. You could pray for hours and you could still feel very disconnected, because the prayer may be true. Like the words you might be saying, it might be right, but the life behind it might be crooked. So some people, they attract a lot of confusion because their words say one thing, but their habits write another thing in the sigil. And truth is the match between speech and the soul. So when your inner world contradicts your outer expansions, you create distortion. It makes me think of the song by Lonnie Liston Smith, Expansions. You know, when you're creating that level of distortion, distortion invites the wrong presence. That's an invocation. See, when you live in truth and you speak the truth and you walk in the truth, your whole life becomes a signal that invites the clarity of the divine. So the Elohim answers the truth, speaks to the truth, dwells with the truth, because truth is the image of Elohim that's alive in you. So people like to pretend a lot of times that attacks come out of nowhere when they talk about spiritual attacks and stuff like that. But most spiritual interference doesn't come from an external strike. This is when people always get mad at me during consultations, when they want to tell me about their family curses and their person on their job who doesn't like them and their husband's ex and all that. And most of the time, the strike is internal. It comes from an internal breach that you have. And the largest breach that most people have is unmanaged emotions. Anger, resentment, jealousy, despair, obsessive longing, emotional immaturity, emotional inconsistency, emotional impulsivity. Those states may feel bad to you, but more than feeling bad, they broadcast a signal. They carve a very chaotic marking into the inner world that operates like a sigil. So it summons whatever thrives in the disorder of those particular emotions. So demonic forces, they don't need you to worship them. A lot of people, they always talking about, oh, Hollywood, they do all these rituals. You don't really have to do all of that. I'm gonna be honest with you. And if anyone knows my background, you know I know. But you don't have to do all of that to invoke a demon. You only have to be an unstable person. They just need your instability. Remember what Elohim Yahuwah told Cain. Sin is crouching at the door and its desire for you. Its desire is for you. That door, that dalit, was emotional agitation. Cain or Cain, some of you know his name is Cain. Cain's unmanaged anger created a spiritual access to other forces. That's what Yahoo was telling him. Like, you don't get a hold of that anger. You're creating a door for things. Proverbs 29 says an angry person stirs up strife, right? So strife is not necessarily conflict. Strife is a spiritual turbulence. And turbulence then attracts entities of confusion. Like when the Quran says Satan or El Shaitan steers dissension among them. Dissension is not something that necessarily is going to happen by accident. Dissension is triggered. It's something that's agitated. It's fed, most importantly, by emotional volatility. That's where you get dissension from. You know, when the Quran says, if a whisper from Shaitan touches you, seek refuge immediately. Hawa didn't do that. She had a conversation. So what that could be translated as emotional surges, they often indicate a spiritual interference. That emotional surge, a lot of times that is Shaitan whispering to you. And it will indicate a spiritual interference and hesitation to deal with it. It makes the breach or the hole even deeper. You know, like you talk to some like people who are like deep in the church or whatever, whenever they get a thought or feeling, they'll be like, the devil's a liar. Or they'll say, the blood of Jesus. I plead the blood of Jesus against that. Get behind me, Satan. This stuff actually works. It doesn't work in the way that they're thinking it works because it's not really applicable in the same way. But at least what they're doing is they're taking their mind immediately from the shadow thought to something else, right? There are more effective things they could do, but it's better than going into it and entertaining it. You know, at the very least, it's better than that. You know, now, unfortunately, a lot of times they use that when you're giving them intelligence. They'll plead the blood of Jesus against you or say the devil's a liar. If you stump them on a question, they'll be like, well, the devil's a liar. Well, but then you being lied to because I just asked you something you can't answer. It's a truthful question. Always remember, energy is emotion, and emotion is energy. And uncontrolled emotion is unassigned energy. All energy needs a place. I've always often said that one of the best things that you could do to picture what God is picture God as energy. Energy is God. God is energy. So imagine an uncontrolled God. Imagine the damage it could create. So your energy, your emotions that are uncontrolled or unassigned, an unassigned energy becomes an open invitation. Oh, you got energy you don't know what to do? I know what to do with it. So emotional chaos distorts the spiritual signature, right? And then your emotional state will reshape that sigil that's etched onto your inner world. And when your emotions begin to spiral, the symbol becomes jagged, it becomes fractured, it becomes unstable, right? So that distorted signature, it then summons forces whose nature matches the distortion. Remember, like attracts like. Even in the unseen world, it's not just, you know, you walking outside sometimes, you see two unattractive people, you're like, oh, it's nice, they found love. Yeah, like attracts like. You see two beautiful people. You see a Boris Kojo and a Nicole Erie Parker. And you're like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, yeah. Of course, they be together, right? Or Rick Fox and Vanessa Williams. Yeah, okay, right? You know, um, that's in the physical. But in the non-physical, in the immaterial, it actually is the same exact thing. So emotional instability, one of the things that it also does is that it lowers your spiritual defenses. The strong emotions drain psychic energy. You felt it before. I know you have. When you've been upset or enraged about something and you've had to keep restrained and you're exhausted as a result. When your psyche is drained, your spiritual immune system gets weaker. And that's when the whispers start feeling louder than they were before. Because your temptations feel stronger, your confusion starts to feel justified, and chaos makes your vessel more porous. You see. One other thing, emotional volatility, it interrupts divine communication. Again, think about that child. You're trying to tell the child something or help the child with something, and they just keep and they're going on. It's like, I can't help you until you calm down. Revelation requires clarity, but chaos clouds your perception. So just like a storm, right? A storm makes it very hard for you to see the horizon. And emotional storms, they make it hard for you to perceive the guidance. And it's not because God is silent. It's because your internal weather is too loud. It's just that simple. A lot of times, again, people, I don't think God listens to me, or God, stop talking to me, or my ancestors don't say anything to you. You got to understand that certain emotions act as a key. And there's certain powerful emotions that unlock inner gates. So love unlocks a gate. Love is the key. I did a segment on that already earlier this year. Truth, compassion, they all open gateways to divine influence. But if the emotion is destructive, envy, despair, rage, it opens up gates to shadow forces. So you don't actually need a ritual to open up a gate. Your feelings will do it for you. See, chaos attracts whatever feeds on chaos, right? When fruit is rotting, what does it attract? Flies. Um, Emotional turbulence attracts entities that thrive in disorder. Your emotions create an atmosphere, and that atmosphere signals what kind of presence can walk through your own personal door. That's why some people's lives feel spiritually crowded. And it's not because they're cursed, it's not because they're undisciplined, maybe physically, but it's because they're undisciplined emotionally. And that's why certain arguments escalate beyond logic, because the atmosphere has already invited something else in. You ever have a back and forth with someone like that? And it gets to a point you're like, what the heck are you talking about? Because their emotion, the outpouring, the fountain, the spray, you don't realize you're inside of a chamber of hell. They've created an atmospheric chamber of hell where all disorder and mental chaos and fragmentation thrive, and you're now there. You see? That's why a lot of times your anxiety will spiral, because there's a door that's been left open. And that's why certain cycles repeat, because there's an emotional signature that someone has that's been unchanged. And when the creator consistently tells us to govern the heart, govern the tongue, govern the spirit, it's because without emotional governance, you become a house without a guard, right? That's like a home without a man. Oof. Emotion is not necessarily your enemy, but the unmanaged emotion is a summoning device. When you govern your emotions, you govern your gates. When you govern your gates, you govern your life. And when your life is governed, then the creator comes closer to you, because now order has returned to the vessel. But some of you have unclean spirits that you keep around. Some doors you open up with your behaviors, because other doors you open just by making contact with the wrong person. Not every relationship that you might have is emotional. Some relationships are a spiritual exchange or an energetic contract, if you will. And gateway forces will come into your life that you were not meant to actually host. Sometimes we get in the way of people's karma. You got some people just straight up demons in this life. All they do is foul stuff, and they keep good people like you around to block what's coming. Be careful. Spiritual leaders, I'm also speaking to you. We attract some really low life people. Low lives. Because they're trying to dodge the creator's karma. And we block it. And they go crazy when we're not there to block it anymore, because they know what's coming to them. Here's one. Men and women. Any of you had children with a demon? I was talking to someone recently, and she was telling me about how her, I think it was her son. Yeah, no, her daughter's father. She was like, yeah, when we were together, he worked 2 jobs. He was doing this, like he was really coming up. And then when we split up, it's like he just nosedived. And I guess he doesn't really spend time with the girl. But he has these nieces and nephews that he spends all his time with. And he cuts, even like times he's supposed to see his daughter, he'll like just cancel out on her to take the niece and nephew somewhere. And she said, she was telling me how the daughter, when she was like even much younger, would have to call him and be like, it's okay, daddy. Like, you just need to come see me. You need to see me. And it's okay. You don't have to bring anything. And it like would be trying to teach him, you know, sad situation. You know, I think it's sad. But I remember saying, to myself, like, yeah, you were bringing I didn't say it to her, but like, you were bringing his karma up when he was with you. You were putting him in a position that was not really designed for him to be. And the Most High is protecting the daughter from his karma. There was some things she told me about that were really sad that happened to him, I guess he had a son. And some tragedies that happened to him, which were probably a part of his karma, but his children were catching the arrows of it. You see, whereas the child he has with her, is not catching the arrows of his karma because she's not standing in the way of it. Even though that's not her intention is to be in the way. Think about that. Translate it to yourself. Especially you community and spiritual leaders. You know what we go through. There are people whose lives just carry chaos. And the moment you attach yourself to them, their atmosphere becomes your atmosphere. So you're not just inviting a person into your life, you're inviting the spiritual ecology that lives behind them. In the unseen world, no person is neutral. There are no neutral people in the unseen world. There are just vessels. And whatever fills a vessel travels with them. Got to remember that. Deuteronomy says, it talks about that certain unions will turn your heart away. That turning doesn't happen by persuasion, it happens by spiritual transfer. So your heart becomes influenced by energies connected to a particular person, right? Proverbs says a companion of fools suffers harm, right? And you can translate that, say, because companionship is not just proximity, it's spiritual absorption. You absorb the psychology, you absorb the emotional patterns and the spiritual residue of whoever you're connected to. In the Quran, it says corrupt people are for corrupt people and good people are for good people, right? So that's not like being an elitist, like a moral elitist. It's a metaphysical recognition that spirits pair people. People don't pair themselves, right? That's why the Quran also talks about people, those who act to be seen. That's 438. It says like whoever takes Shaitan as an intimate companion, evil is that companion. So you could translate that or think about it as like some people carry an influence that you don't see, but you can feel it. And companionship with them extends that influence into your life. Relationships are contracts written in behavior and attention, emotional energy. So what happens beneath the surface is that people carry their signatures, and every person marked by their habits. They're marked by their habits, they're marked by their choices, they're marked by their trauma, they're marked by their desires, and that mark is a living sigil. So that sigil is that symbol that their life has carved into the unseen. So when you bond with another person, your signature intertwines with theirs. And that's why certain relationships feel like an entanglement. You've never seen the Gucci logo and the Louis Vuitton logo entwined with each other. If you did and someone tried to sell you something like that, you would probably not purchase it. You would know it's fugazi. Your contact is the transmission. These two are not supposed to transmit into each other. Conversation is a transfer. Emotional vulnerability is a transfer. Sex is a transfer. Living with each other is a transfer. Arguing with each other is a transfer. So you are exchanging atmospheric patterns and spiritual residue. See, they're Damians. Their demons, their shadow forces become your shadow forces. If a person carries instability, their instability becomes part of your emotional weather, if you will. If they carry manipulation, then your perception becomes distorted around them. If they have rebellion, if they have lust, if they have fear, if they have obsession, then those energies attempt to settle inside of your home. They try to settle inside of your mind. They try to settle inside of your body. And it's not because you're weak. If any of you listening feel like, man, that's me and it's happening. It's not because you're weak. I don't want you to feel bad in that sense. It's because you granted permission through proximity. That's all. Relationships, they create spiritual pathways, and repeated contact, it forms a channel between two different lives. Like any other channel you would try. If you carving wood, you're not just gonna go once, right? With a chisel, you're gonna go over and over and over again until you carve a nice deep grove and channel. And that channel affects the free flow of energy and presence and influence. So once a channel exists, whatever influences them now has partial access to you. And, that's why a lot of times the wrong relationship can feel like a spiritual suffocation. There's an open channel and something is breathing through that channel and taking part of your breath. You also end up inheriting people's battles, man. The moment intimacy is established, you inherit the warfare attached to that other person's life. So if they're tormented, you feel the spillover. If they're double-minded, now your peace becomes very unstable. If they carry generational residue, your home becomes a battleground. And it's not because you personally have sinned, it's because you've bonded. And bonding is invocation. This is why the originator warned us. It's not because like the creator is trying to restrict love or prevents, or trying to prevent happiness. The creator is trying to prevent contamination. Some of you folks listening, man, you've been fighting spirits that were never even assigned to your life. We were all assigned our own struggle, all of us, myself included. I have things that I've been struggling with since I was a little boy. And I'm like, enough already. And then I have to remember the timeline of the universe and realize that I'm still pretty much a little boy. But then when some stuff isn't yours. When you're like, man, this ain't right. Because sometimes things will enter into your world through someone you let get too close. And some of you feel spiritually heavy because you're carrying someone else's warfare. That's why you feel so heavy all the time. You're carrying someone else's resolved battles into your atmosphere. So you've lost clarity as a result. The moment a certain person entered into your life, that wasn't coincidence. That was a transfer. And that's why the creator says, don't be equally yoked. It's not a religious slogan. People like to use it. And I'll break that down one day because people really had that one really messed up. It's a warning that the yoke is not just a partnership. The yoke is you're now sharing consequences. You're sharing spiritual consequences because people are portals and the wrong portal can swallow your progress. A lot of times, rebellion is one of the most underestimated spiritual gateways. People think that rebellion is like a personality. For me personally, I think of like James Dean, and he famously had the like rebel without a cause, right? And you look at those type of if you've ever seen the movie, I mean, there's another movie that came out. I mean, you had the James Dean piece, but there was another movie that came out On the Edge. Matt Dillon was in that. That was probably still is one of my favorites. But it was basically Rebel Without a Cause. And so people take on this personification, this idea, this vision, this look of what the rebel is, right? And people think that when you're a rebel, it's because you're independent. It's because you're being strong. Nope. I've heard people, classify their children the same way. Oh, this one's a rebel. It's not a personality, it's a frequency. And it's a frequency that attracts whatever thrives inside of defiance, whatever thrives inside of distortion, and whatever thrives inside of disorder. You've heard me teach before about even the Uajet and the Wajet and Nile Valley order, right? The energy benders, the serpentine guardians, if you will. Those who kind of move power in accordance with natural hierarchy, divine structure, ma'at, truth, cosmic balance. They're not even rebels. They're custodians of order. And I bring those up because I think about how many people say, I'm a rebel, I'm a witch. I've heard women say it all the time. It's like, you're not a witch. Like, you don't even know what a witch is. It's because you got some sage and some crystals. It doesn't make you a witch. You're just rebellious. You're just thriving. You're just going against the natural order. The Uajet and the Wajet, they were energy benders who existed within Ma'at and the natural order and within cosmic balance. They weren't just immature feminists. They were custodians of order. They bent energy because they are already bent to the commandments of nature and of the creator. So their authority came from obedience, not from ego. You know, there's so many people who replace discipline with delusion, just like they replace order with chaos. But, you know, we have a generation, like I said, of people walking around today with a sage bundle, a crystal, a tattoo of an ankh, you know, and they call themselves oracles or call themselves healers, empaths, energy workers, you know, take it off, whatever it is. But in reality, they're just rebellious, hard-headed, emotionally unstable people with control tactics, narcissism, immorality, and disorder. And they're masquerading it as spirituality. They're not Uajet, they're not Wajet. They're just fractured vessels attempting to manipulate forces. And whenever rebellion tries to wield spiritual power, the result is always the same: contamination. Why is that? Because rebellion bends the inner sickle. It warps your inner symbol. And a warped symbol summons warped spirits. 1 Samuel 15:22. Rebellion is the sin of witchcraft. Right? That doesn't mean because it's necessarily because rebellion itself is evil. It's because both operate outside of divine structure. So rebellion is spiritual theft. It's trying to gain power without the internal order required to wield the power. The Quran, it says they invoke nothing but a rebellious shaitan. So what you could translate is that when you operate inside of rebellion, you're not resisting Allah or the Elohim. You're calling the spirit that mirrors your defiance. So rebellion is not necessarily just a disagreement. Rebellion is the rejection of hierarchy. Whereas when you have Elohim building that into that hierarchy, built it into the cosmos. So you're rejecting the order and the architecture of the cosmos. So the Uajet and the Wajet move within the hierarchy of the cosmos, where their power comes from. Rebellious people, they try to overturn the order of things. That's the society we live in. Everything's upside down in the saddest of ways. I spoke about that, I think, when I covered the alpha male, alpha female broadcast many years ago, you know, and how it's driving certain real women and real men out of their minds. You know, what rebellion does underneath the surface is that it distorts the inner circle and the inner sigil. The Nile Valley serpent, it symbolized straight vision, you see, disciplined energy and rightful rulership. So the rebellion twists that symbol. It bends it out of proportion. You know, it creates a sigil that invites forces of disorder. You know, rebellious or rebellion energy, it fractures the vessel. The Uajet and the Wajet, they protect the throne, but rebellion destroys its own throne from within. You know, a fractured vessel cannot host divine insight. A fractured vessel can only host confusion. So rebellion attempts to control, but not to serve. You know, rebellious people seek to dominate, to manipulate. They crave influence, you know, and not to serve. So rebellion mimics authority, but it lacks the morality that goes along with that authority. That's where you'll see a lot of spiritual jargon with no discipline, crystals, no character, astrology with no integrity, magic with no morality, rituals, without any obedience, intuition mixed with a whole lot of personal drama, or you'll see a lot of divinity mixed with a whole lot of dysfunction. Those are counterfeit Uajet. That's a serpent with no throne, no purpose, no order, no divine backing. Rebellion collapses cosmic hierarchy into, when you have a real spiritual system, whether it's from the Congo or Yoruba or it's Hebrew or it's Nile Valley, your hierarchy becomes your protection. So a rebellious person rejects the protection and they become exposed to predatory forces because they reject the protection. Because anything that refuses to bow will eventually become bound. That's why some people are spiritually chaotic, and it's not because they're gifted, it's because they're disordered. So there's some people who they weaponize their spirituality because their rebellion has disguised itself as intuition, and that's why there's some relationships that will always crumble around them, because everything they touch, it becomes pulled into the vortex of their ungoverned nature. That's why their healing tends to drain you, or their intuition tends to always mislead you. Their magic kind of destabilizes your household. It's because they're rebellious vessels. That's all. They're trying to operate in systems that are designed for obedience and balance and spiritually structured people. They're not Uajet. They're not Wajet. Again, they're not even energy stewards. They are energy pollutants. It summons whatever thrives in confusion, ego, and mistrust. So rebellion is not independence. Rebellion is exposure. It's an invitation. It's a summons. It's when rebellious souls will never be called to the Creator, ever. you know. And when you are in the midst of that and you're bowing to that and you're applauding that and you're clicking like to that and you're sharing that, you're weakening your own boundaries. And weak boundaries are not kindness. They're not compassion. They're not humility. Weak boundaries are permission slips that you give to the unseen world. And in the unseen world, a person with a weak boundary is like a house with a door that's wide open with the lights on and there's no guard at the gate, and anything can walk in and anything can sit down and any presence can take root in an environment like that, because boundaries are not emotional walls. Boundaries are spiritual gates. And the ones who govern the gate govern the atmosphere. So when your boundaries collapse, your atmosphere becomes accessible to whatever force is there. And so Proverbs says, guard your heart with all diligence, or out of it will flow the issues of life, or for out of it flow the issues of life. Guarding the heart is not romantic language. It may sound like it. It's spiritual warfare. It's a spiritual defensive tactic. Your heart is the throne of your inner world. So if you don't guard it, you invite forces that would sit there. And the Quran speaks about that. The whisperer who withdraws, the whisperer who whispers into the heart of mankind, the whisperer seeks an opening. He can't enter a guarded heart. He can't go where he's not given access, but weak boundaries provide the access. So boundaries are not protection from people. They are protection from spirits that those people carry. Look at Kevin Gates. You can't touch that guy. Every interview, please don't touch me. He won't let you touch him, won't let it hug him, can't touch his shoulder, nothing. It's not because he's afraid of the individual, but he's concerned about the spirits that individual comes with. You see, weak boundaries are a tear in the sigil of your soul. So when your inner symbol, which is the spiritual signature that you've been building through your truth, through your discipline, through your obedience, through your stillness, all the things that we've spoken about, it develops edges that define what can approach your life. And when your boundaries are weakened, those edges begin to dissolve. The sigil loses its clarity. The form becomes permeable in that moment, right? And a permeable symbol, it invites intrusion. So what's happening beneath the surface is your weak boundaries begin to blur the spiritual signature. If your yes is soft, or like if your no is kind of hesitant, if your emotional gates kind of remain unlocked, then the sigil, it etched into your inner world, it starts to become faint, right? It's like having a house and it says this home is the property of so and so, no trespassing. And then, through all your weakening of your boundaries and, that sign gets weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker. And then next thing you know, you'll get squatters because nobody's here. The gate was open. The door was open. There was no sign. I'm here. So weak boundaries attract predatory forces because just as predators in nature sense vulnerabilities, spiritual predators sense emotional permeability, right? So people with weak boundaries, they always attract manipulators, they attract narcissists, they attract energy vampires, they attract destabilized partners, they attract chaotic personalities. That's not a coincidence. That's a signal recognition. You see, your boundary failure emits a signature that these different kind of personalities instinctively respond to. So weak boundary, it merges atmospheres. When you can't say no, you allow foreign atmospheres to merge with yours. So their anxiety, your anxiety, their confusion, your confusion, their spirits, your spirits, right? And that's why some people, when they come around you, they feel heavier, right? Because their boundaries allow spiritual transfer without infiltration. That's why you feel that sometimes. When certain people get around you, like, ugh. Your weak boundaries are creating a spiritual co-ownership. And whenever you tolerate through your weak boundaries, people's lives become your spiritual identity. You don't have to agree with someone's spirit to share its consequences. You just need to allow access. Weak boundaries create spiritual agreements without verbal consent. I've spoken about that before when, we all have that. Well, I don't, but a lot of times I've spoken to women and they have that, I'll use a nicer word, that promiscuous friend. You're like, oh, she's just crazy. She's so crazy. Or like in good times, they had Walona. Walona was on a different date almost every night. And he's like, oh, but that's just Walona. No, that's all of y'all now. That's Florida now. That's Thelma now. Everybody's going to be affected by the atmosphere of someone who's bringing that sort of weak morality. Or you got that friend you just love, but they got no spiritual backing at all. They have no spiritual truth or understanding that they're operating in. Yeah, I used to go to church. I go to church once in a while, or I go to church every Sunday. Well, if you are dealing with this kind of truth, what ANU truth, that's not the type of person that you really want to be intertwined with like that, because they'll bring that church confusion into your life, even when you don't verbally consent, because weak boundaries sabotage divine protection. Boundaries are not anti-love. It doesn't mean I don't love you because I establish a boundary. Boundaries are divine architecture. When you refuse to enforce your boundaries, you are rejecting the form of the creator that was intended for your soul. Divine presence rests on order. Order rests on structure. So structure rests on boundaries. So without the boundaries, nothing holy is going to be able to stay for long. I know this is a long segment, but this is something I really, really want to get through with you all. It's important. And this is why some of you feel spiritually drained. Your gates are wide open while you sleep. You don't bind anything. You don't reject anything. You allow everything, and that's why you confuse sympathy with covenant, because your emotional doors are always unlocked. This is why every troubled person seems to find you, because your spiritual signature announces that you will allow their chaos to take residence. That's why your home feels heavy, because you've allowed too many atmospheres inside. Hey, let me put a side note. All you polygynous families out there, Be careful. Sometimes polygyny can be a revolving door of women. Not in a good way. I'm not saying like a single bachelor who's out here just sleeping with a bunch of people. But I'm saying sometimes there's a lot of starts and fails. People don't realize that about polygyny. They think it's just this merry-go-round, and it's just, oh, it's all fun, and it's very difficult. And then, like, I've had people say, then why do it? Because it's my nature. Why does a king rule a kingdom, even though the kingdom is giving them headache? You know how many times I've heard Minister Farrakhan complain about, man, y'all, this, and y'all. Why does he keep doing it? Because it's his calling to do. It's his nature. It's his culture. It's his identity. This is what he does. It's what he does. Whales swim, birds fly. You know, kings and rulers and masters have multiple women. But there's so much intelligence that has to go. And multiple women, I'm not just saying, again, like the bachelor lifestyle. I'm talking about marriage, commitment, faithfulness, respect, loyalty. That's hard. It's easier just to have multiple women, not just to be a bachelor and just be moving around and swiping right, swiping right, or swiping left. That's easy. But courtships and conversations and merging atmospheres, merging households, and that's tough to do it the right way. And a lot of times there's a lot of starts and stops. You see, and sometimes the merging of all those atmospheres will make a heavy home. You see. And then when that happens, you can't think clearly because now your spirit isn't filtering what enters. Weak boundaries are not a character flaw, they're a summoning flaw. You don't have to perform witchcraft to invite these spirits. You just have to leave the gates unguarded. That's it. But when you strengthen your boundaries, your no, or your distance, or your standards, or your emotional discipline, your signal then sharpens, your atmosphere begins to stabilize, and your vessels become protected again. So guarding your heart is not it's not selfish. It's the first act of spiritual sovereignty. Neglect I want you to understand something too. Neglect is not a passive thing. It's not harmless. It's not accidental. Neglect is an invitation. It's an invitation. Every area that you refuse to maintain becomes available real estate in the unseen world. So your body, your finances, your home, your relationships, your emotional life, they aren't just your responsibilities. They're your territory that you have to maintain. And when you neglect, that's abdication. Something will come in. You see, when Scripture says poverty will come upon you like a thief. It's not just it's mental poverty, it's spiritual poverty, emotional poverty. You know, when the Quran says, "Do not be like those who forgot Allah," so He calls them to forget themselves. Forgetting Elohim is forgetting yourself. Forgetting the self leads to neglect. And neglect creates it creates a vacuum. And it's a vacuum through which outside influences enter. Come on, come on, come on. Neglect is not forgetting chores. Neglect is forgetting your spiritual identity. So self-neglect, it weakens your sigil. And your spiritual signature, it gets weakened it gets shaped by your care, by your intention, by your stewardship, by your discipline. But neglect begins to dissolve those markings in the unseen world. You know, it signals that this is unguarded territory. So the inner structure starts to collapse. It creates a spiritual rot. Just as like when you don't maintain foods and maintain areas where life can decay then summons more decay. That's why we say one bad apple spoils the bunch. You see, neglect lowers your spiritual voltage. You know, when you have a healthy soul and a healthy spirit, it radiates energy. And a neglectful one drains the spirit. So low voltage attracts parasitic energies. It attracts parasitic people, parasitic atmospheres that feed on the little bit of strength that's left over. Your neglect breaks the dominion. You can't rule what you don't properly steward. And when a steward is absent, dominion appears. Neglect, like I said, it invites self-forgetting. That's why the Quran says when you forget the Elohim, it leads to forgetting yourself. Your identity becomes weak. Your purpose becomes blurred. Your self-neglect is spiritual erasure. That's why some people feel mentally foggy all the time. They have neglected the spiritual hygiene that's necessary. Their homes always feel heavy. Certain habits begin to spiral because neglect has a way of making open pathways for darker shadow entities. You don't need a ritual to summon a spirit. You just need to stop caring for the territory that Elohim gave you. Neglect is a spiritual void, and all voids are hungry. And when you restore order, when you take ownership again, you end up cleaning up your life. You strengthen your routine. You care for your body. You reset your mind. You protect your home. You reclaim territory. You reestablish dominion. You redraw the sigil. You drive out whatever entered through that vacancy, and the presence of Elohim returns because there's a steward back in the house again. Don't worry, I'm closing. You have heard a principle today, how obedience summons the holy, how discipline strengthens the vessel, how your stillness will invite presence, how your service creates divine pathways, how truth engraves a sacred signature, how chaos then and rebellion, it opens the gates. You've heard those things, right? You could, of course, always rewind and go back and listen again. But I want to say something as well in closing that I think is very important. You will never rise above the spirit that you call. Never. Every single pattern calls something. Every habit that you have, it summons something. Every lifestyle that you call yourself living, it invites something. So every spiritual practice, whether that practice is clean or whether that practice is corrupt, it draws something into your world. That's not just a message for those who are righteous. The message is also for those of you who dibble and dabble in the occult, the hidden knowledge. I know what the word occult means. I broke it down a long time ago. So I'm not speaking about the literal occult. I'm talking about the parathentical occult. Those places you got no business being because you do not have the nervous system, the knowledge, the wisdom, or the experience to even exist there. How many of you have put 40 years into study first? Some of you read a book or watched a weak documentary, and within 1 year, you're a shadow worker. You're committing spiritual suicide. 40 years minimum of study. 40. So you have shadow manipulators, you got amateur magicians, you have self-appointed witches, you have Instagram witches, Instagram mystics, you have hood shamans, ghetto gurus, all of these different people who are trying to pull in energy that they don't have the ability to govern. And they're calling on forces that they can't then dismiss properly. So I'm gonna make it plain. You can't steal divine power. You can only borrow demonic influence. And the bill is always going to be greater than the benefit. I remember speaking to someone before, And he was telling me about how he deals with Torah, and he started learning tarot because of Torah. And he thought the two were connected because the words sound similar. So he was doing rituals based on Torah with tarot. Now, you've heard me break down tarot before. You've heard me break down Torah. You've heard me break down Kabbalah. You've heard me break down the Tree of Life. And you've heard me break down a lot of different things. But it doesn't mean I jumble it all up into a jambalaya. It just means I know different junk. But I know what goes together, and I know what's opposed. And even if it's not really a mixing, as sometimes people say. I saw an old comment on a video that I did years ago where someone said, you can't mix the orishas with chakras. You don't understand what either one of them are. So like, stop talking. That's like saying you can't mix chewing with food because food is over there, but your body's over here. You don't understand how these things are, how these mechanisms go together. Or that's like me explaining something about a light that's on, but then talking about the sun and saying, well, you can't mix the two. You don't know the nature of fire, electricity, or light. You need to chill out. You need to take the 40 years to study and stop trying to race to be an influencer. But I've seen people who have mixed the Holy Quran with chaos magic. Now, it wasn't smart. I know someone who once said that the pathway to the ancestral energy is through lust. There are two very notable people who used to teach that, and they're both in jail right now. Both in prison. Let me not say jail. They're both in prison right now. One is probably never coming home, and the other one probably got about another 6 years, I think, to do. You'll figure it out. And the one who's got the less time calls the one who's probably never getting out his spiritual father. You'll figure it out. I've seen people who have mixed Nile Valley symbolism with disorder, serpent energy with rebellion, intuition with unhealed trauma, channeling with emotional instability. People who have convinced themselves that they're mystics. You're not. You're a portal. And not for the things that you're imagining. Your sigil is crooked and your atmosphere is contaminated. Your spirit is porous and your rituals are reckless. And now your life is answering to it. I'm not judging you. I'm diagnosing you. Deuteronomy 18:10-12. It talks about the mixing of divination with divine worship. And it's not because the creator is fragile. It's not that. It's because mixing opens up the doors that you can't close. Can't close them. It's like me trying to pick a lock while at the same time my man is hitting it with a hammer. I don't like how that sounded. Pause. I'm trying to pick a lock, but I'm with a person who has a crowbar and they're trying to pry the door open while at the same time I'm trying to pick it. Two different methods. We're going to cause irreversible damage to this door and not be able to close it back. When Samuel's 15:23 talks about rebellion being witchcraft, it's because both operate outside of the hierarchy, where the Quran speaks about people who seek help from rebellious spirits only increase their ruin. Even the Quran in 21, it talks about people who practice magic learned what harmed them and not what benefited them. You see, magic without moral order is self-destruction and it's disguised as empowerment. So the creator doesn't share the space with spirits you invited out of rebellion. You can't call on the Elohim and chaos in the same breath. Just like you can't mix divine law and, shadow shortcuts. If you live inside of the shadow, you can't summon the light. It doesn't work, right? You keep running to the shadow when the light shows up, or the light's going to cast away the shadow. You can't have them both. So I'll tell you how it works in the unseen. Any force that you call through this order will own a portion of you. And you can't control what you summon outside of divine law, where you are most powerful. There's no such thing as white magic or safe shadow work or high frequency witchcraft. That's just marketing language. That's all marketing language that people have created to keep you in spiritual slavery. Every bit of shadow work acts to generate a sigil on your soul. And even the ones that you perform ignorantly still create the sigil. And those sigils are readable. Entities respond to them. And once a gateway is marked, the presence returns whether you invite it or not. Once that spot is marked. Back in the days, I remember buying, when I was younger, there was a thing where you could buy cars from like the police auctions. I had friends who was doing that. Because back then, even more so than now, cars are not the same status symbol that they were when I was younger. But a car with some rims and a system, that was like, it was a status symbol. I was always against it. I was always against that for multiple reasons, but I'm going to give you one of them. I'm going to be driving around in somebody's car who has a street life. How do I know that someone who may have had a challenge with that person will not think that I'm that person driving that car and do something to me based on that car being marked? I felt even the same way with because the police auctions, they not only sell cars that they've confiscated, but they also sell old police vehicles. No. Who's been hurt inside of here? Who's been done wrong? And again, this car is marked. Even when you think it's not marked, we know it's you. That car is marked. So what else am I inviting into my world that I'm not intentionally inviting? Once the gateway is marked, the presence will return whether you invite it or not. Women, pay attention to that when you think about who you've been with and who you're choosing to be with. Anything that's gained through your rebellion will require a piece of your sanity. It will require a piece of your peace. It will require your best relationships as a sacrifice, because magic is never free. Power without righteousness always charges an interest rate. So you'll never control a spirit that's summoned through impurity. It will always control you. And the moment you reach for power without obedience, you change who answers the call right there in that moment. If you summon power through your obedience, you get one thing. You summon without the obedience, you get another thing. The originator will never inhabit a vessel that entertains his rivals. Loyalty is something. Loyalty is something. Where do you think you got that spirit from? Where do you think 50 Cent got that from? You say, oh, he's petty. Oh, because I accomplished it. No, that's something that's mirroring a divine reality. I'm like that. I'm fiercely loyal, but I pay attention to those who are also not loyal to me. You see, you can't get me. You can't get into my presence again. I can't inhabit a space where you have or are allegiant to a rival, to an enemy. You can't be in the same space. Light doesn't negotiate with shadow, just gets rid of it. And order doesn't share a throne with rebellion. I want you Jezebel-minded females to consider that. You want to come into a man's space where there's a throne and authority, but you want to be rebellious. You want to have both. You need an Ahab. Ahab will let you do that. A divine man never would. So if I'm speaking to you in a very plain sense, all of you, who have you been calling? Who answers you when you meditate? Who responds to your rituals? Who has been filling your room at night? Who whispers to you when you're alone? Who fuels your intuition? That dream you had the other night that was so profound, who gave you that dream? Who empowered your manifestation that you had recently? All this thing came out. Who empowered it? All of you Oshun women and Sekhmet women, Oya women, who energized your sexuality? Think about the last person you slept with. Who stood behind that person? Think about the last person you had an argument with. Who touched you through the person that you argued with? Here's one. Who's sitting in your atmosphere right now? Because something's always answering you. Something always answers. And if your life is not built on obedience and discipline and truth and stillness and service and divine structure, it will not be the creator of all worlds who answers your call. You cannot serve two masters. You can't serve two kingdoms. You can't live under two laws. Your sigil or your spiritual symbol, your internal signature, your lifestyle imprint, it declares who you belong to. I would urge you today to decide whose handwriting is on your soul and decide if you're going to be a vessel of order or a vessel of invasion. Either you're going to host the creator and the most high, or you're going to host the forces that oppose the heavenly order. So you'll either walk as a steward or you'll live as a portal. That's all. You know, choose who your call is going to be, who your kingdom is going to be, you know, who you want to answer. And I would urge you to really choose wisely, because these choices, they shape your entire life. You know, there's no neutrality. Like I told you, in the spiritual world, you're either governed or you're occupied. That's it. Just like in this world and in the spiritual world, you are either covered or you're exposed. So you're either under divine law or under spiritual influences that I bet you can't explain. You don't have the luxury of pretending anymore. Everything you do writes a symbol on your soul, and every habit, it creates a mark. Every emotion redraws your signature, and the heavens read that thing and hell reads it at the same time. They're both reading. What's it going to be, right? Your ancestors are reading it. Your future is reading it. Your children will inherit the mark. I'm not trying to, it's not entertainment. It's inheritance, so we're talking about bloodline business. I will just leave you with this. What you refuse to master will eventually master you. And if you choose to refuse obedience, then you will be owned by rebellion. If you refuse discipline, then you'll be ruled by chaos. For those of you who choose to refuse truth, deception will always find you. If you're going to refuse boundaries, then you will be shaped by intrusion. There's no middle ground. You're choosing your kingdom with every breath. And let me tell you something, man. Higher functioning heavenly beings are not confused about who you are. Lower functioning bestial hellish beings are not confused about who you are. You're the only one that's undecided. It's just you. So you can choose a life where your highest ideas can establish and live themselves within your vessels. You know, you can choose a vessel that commands. Rather, I'm going to say you could choose a signature that commands and respects the unseen. You can choose a path where your children inherit your strength and they don't inherit spirits that were never theirs to have to carry. Because at the end of the day, the spiritual world doesn't respond to your intentions. The spiritual world, it responds to your condition. You need to throw out all that. God knows my heart. Yeah, God knows your heart, whatever your God is. But you got to fix the condition in order to sharpen the signature. You got to clean the house. You got to close the gates. You got to stand in your authority. And when you say something like, call on me, I will that heaven recognizes your voice and answers you without hesitation. And something else doesn't creep up in there. Because many of you are being ruled and shaped right now by that something else. Thank you. All right. I know this was a very long segment. I had a lot I had to share with you. And this is something that I find heartbreaking that a lot of you are going through, thinking you're on a path that you're not really on, or that you're talking to something that you're not really speaking to, and trying to figure out why your heart is so heavy and why you're calling so much chaos and so many horrible people into your life. And you're thinking, just because I don't do quote unquote witchcraft or deal with the occult or whatever, what the heck is going on? Because you are always dealing with the occult every day. We're dealing with the occult right now. You're always dealing with that which is hidden. And you have to make a determination as to how you're going to deal and from what vantage point. That's all. All right. So thank you so much for spending this time. This is Chief Yuya, head Jegna of the ANU Nation, Chief Priest of ANU Life Global Ministries. And stay tuned. Make sure you're subscribed and share with people who need to share. And feel free to leave your comments. Y'all see, I read them. I read them and I respond, because it's one of the few ways that I get to kind of have some feedback, interaction with you all. I'm always interested in hearing what aspects spoke to who, and why. Or sometimes it'd be like, this is crazy. I was just thinking about this. Or, I just saw a note on this, just had a conversation about this. Now you're talking about it. That happens very often. I stay in the groove. I stay in the groove between myself and El Elyon, those cosmic controllers. All right, everyone, be well today, okay? Peace.